So what we find here is, in our world today, it's a very complicated place. It's a very stormy world that we live in. I mean, if you look around and you're aware of what's going on, the world is just so full of distractions, uncertainties. We're burdened in so many ways. A lot of us, many of us here tonight, we're getting older, and as we get older, your health's not what it used to be. It's just a simple reality. So we have health concerns, and we have just circumstances that we find ourselves in, and circumstances quite often not of our making. You know, it's one thing if I do something foolish or I do something, well, that's my fault. You know, but a lot of times I find myself in circumstances that weren't of my making. It wasn't anything that I did, but nevertheless, I'm still in those circumstances. And what we find simply is this, that, this world that we live in, this world system is designed by Satan to crush our faith and to distract us, to cause us to lose our focus on God. It's just to discourage us in our walk with God. And therefore we find ourselves that we've got to be of a diligent nature. We cannot have a passive Christianity. And I think too often today in our world, we're living in this passive Christianity type of an attitude. But we've got to be diligent. We've got to be assertive in our walk with the Lord. We see in Matthew chapter 24, you don't have to turn to them. We're just going to really actually read parts of these verses. Most of them are verses we know anyway, but Matthew 24:42, it says, "Watch therefore, for ye know not what hour your Lord may come." A lot of us talk, and I know I find myself saying it a lot. When we see everything that's going on in the world and the turmoil and all that, we say, I really believe the Lord's coming back soon. And I say that, and I really believe that the Lord is coming back soon because the stage is set. I mean, those of us who understand anything even of the end-time events as the Bible proclaims, the stage is set. For the Lord to come back. Now, when I say He's coming back soon, though, do I really, and I'm speaking for myself, do I really believe He's going to come back today? Or do I just think, well, maybe in a month, maybe next year? Because that's soon. I don't know, most of us, it'll be next year before we know it. 3 months of this year is gone already, but should I anticipate that the Lord is coming back soon, or should I anticipate that the Lord could come back today? If I think the Lord could come back today, if I really live with that conviction, the Lord could come back, it makes a difference in how I live. But if I'm living with this concept, well, the Lord might come back soon. I think too many of us are looking for the Lord to come back soon. We're not really looking, the Lord could come back today. Because if I think and really believe that He could come back today, I would be more diligent in my life today. But we've got to lose that idea He could just come back soon and really adopt this idea that He could come back today. All right, so the next one we'll look at in Matthew chapter 26, the disciples were admonished to watch and to pray. Are we living in a day where we're really watching and praying? Now, I believe it's always been the reality of the church that you have more people, or in every generation of the church for the last 2,000 years, you have a certain part of the church that is more diligent in watching and praying. But in our day, in our time, are we? The question isn't so much in our day, the church, I think we are in this Laodicean time where we're a lukewarmness. There's just a passiveness, a lukewarmness in the church. But does that have to be the condition of my heart? If the world and the church in general in our day is passive, it doesn't mean that I have to be passive. So we need to ask ourselves, can I truthfully say that I live with this attitude that I watch and I pray? 1 Corinthians 16:13, it says, "Watch ye, stand fast in the faith, In Colossians 4:2, he says, watch ye in the same with thanksgiving. So in 1 Thessalonians 5:6, he says, let us watch and be sober. In 1 Peter 4:7, he says, be sober and watch unto prayer. So we see all through the Bible that we're called to be diligent in our walk with God. But I think too many times, and I'll at least just speak for myself, I'm letting life I'm kind of just flowing with life. And that's not really the way God wants me to live. God wants me to have this diligent attitude that I am living my life. I'm not just letting life pull me along and I'm just flowing down, say, the current of life, but that I am actually living because I'm diligent, in my walk with God. So we want to look at two things here tonight. One of them is simply this, that sometimes God will use the faith of one person to inspire many people. And sometimes you might find yourself in a situation where you are that one person that God wants to use. We find comfort in numbers. We like to be parts of groups, kind of have others around us. But there are times when God simply chose one person to stand out in the crowd and to be a voice for Him. And we're going to look tonight, if you will, at Acts chapter 27. We have the story there. Paul and he finds himself on a ship, and they end up in a shipwreck. It's a story that probably all of us here tonight know quite well. All right, so in Acts chapter 27, we'll begin reading here in verse 9, and it says, and now when much time was spent, and when sailing was now dangerous, because the fast was already past, Paul admonished them and said unto them, sirs, I perceive that the voyage will be with hurt and much danger, not only to the lading and the ship, but also to our lives. Nevertheless, the centurion believed the master and owner of the ship more than those things which were spoken by Paul. And because the haven was not commodious to winter in, the more part advised to depart thence also, if by any means they might obtain to Phoenix, and there to winter, which is a haven in Crete, and lieth toward the southwest and the northwest. And when the south wind blew softly, supposing that they had obtained their purpose, loosing thence, they sailed close by Crete. But not long after, there arose against it a tempestuous wind called Euroclydon. And when the ship was caught and could not bear up into the wind, we let her drive. And running under a certain island, which is called Claudia, we had much work to come by the boat, which when they had taken up, they used helps undergirding the ship, and fearing lest they should fall into the quicksand, struck sail, and so were driven. And being exceedingly tossed with a tempest, the next day they lightened the ship, and the third day we cast out with our hands the tackling of the ship. And when neither sun nor stars in many days appeared, and no small tempest lay on us, all hope that we should be saved was then taken away. But after long abstinence, Paul stood forth in the midst of them and said, Sir, you should have hearkened unto me, and not have loosed from Crete, and have gained this harm and loss. And now I exhort you to be of good cheer, for there shall be no loss of any man's life among you, but of the ship. And there stood by me this night the angel of the Lord, whose I am and whom I serve, saying, Fear not, Paul, thou must be brought before Caesar, and lo, God hath given thee all them that sail with thee. Wherefore, sirs, be of good cheer, for I believe God, that it shall be even as it was told me. Howbeit we must cast upon a certain island. But when the 14 days was come, and we were driven up and down in Adara, about midnight, the shipmen deemed that they drew near to some country, and sounded and found it 20 fathoms. And when they had gone a little further, they sounded again and found it 15 fathoms. Then fearing lest we should have fallen upon rocks, he cast 4 anchors out of the stern and wished for the day. And as the shipmen were about to flee out of the ship, when they had let down the boat into the sea under the color as though they would cast anchors out of the foreship, Paul said unto the centurion and to the soldiers, except these abide in the ship, we cannot be saved. Then the soldiers cut off the ropes of the boat and let her fall off. And while the day was coming on, Paul besought them all to take meat, saying that this day is the 14th day that ye have tarried and continued fasting, having taken nothing. Wherefore I pray you to take some meat, for this is for your health. For there shall not an hair fall from the head of any of you. And when he had thus spoken, he took bread and gave thanks to God in the presence of them all. And when he had broken it, he began to eat. Then were they all of good cheer. They also took some meat. And we were in the ship, and we were in all in the ship 276 souls. So we'll just stop there. All right, this is a story all of us, I think, are really familiar with. It's a real common story. All right, but in this story, I think we find an interesting case. Paul, we all know, is a what? He's a prisoner on the ship. He's not a passenger. He's a prisoner. He's been escorted to Rome under Roman guard. But we see one thing about Paul throughout this story. If you will, in verse 9, it says, Paul admonished them. And we go down further in verse 21, Paul stood forth in the midst of them and said, and Paul says in verse 31, it says, Paul said to the centurion. In verse 33, and while they were coming, Paul besought them. What we see here, now, Paul is a prisoner. Does this seem a little bit strange that Paul, the prisoner on the ship, as you read the story, you almost get the impression, or I don't know if you even would say almost, I get the impression Paul's calling the shots. And he is what? He's a prisoner of Rome on the ship. But as you read the story, now in the beginning, Paul besought them, and he'll come back later and say, what? Should have listened to me. He gives them advice, and they didn't take it. The centurion said, nah, he just go with the captain of the ship, the master. Ignored Paul. And he realized later he should have what? He should have listened to Paul. And then the rest of the story, we simply find that Paul, I don't think it's just Paul seems to be in control of everything in the situation. The men were getting ready to jump ship is what they were getting ready to do. They were letting down the boat. They weren't letting down that boat just to let it sail off empty. They were going to jump in it. And Paul says you better stop them because what? Unless everybody stays on, what did the centurion do? Cut the ropes in. But listen, the whole point here is simply this. Paul, and well, let's just look at it again. Not just let me talk. All right, look, if you will, in verse 22, and it says, now I exhort you to be of good cheer, for there shall be no loss of any man's life among you, but of the ship. For there stood by me this night an angel of the Lord, whose I am and whom I serve. In verse 25 he says, wherefore, sirs, be of good cheer, for I believe God, that it shall be even as it was told me. Listen, Paul has been bold in the fact that he is what? He is a man of God, and that the angel of God appeared to him and told him, listen, is he a quiet Christian? Is he just... Now look, it would have been, if the angel would have appeared to him, Paul could have just been, well, everything's going to be okay. God told me that. But no, Paul here, he's bold and he stands up. But he's been assertive through all of this. He might be a prisoner. His circumstances might not be what we would call the best circumstances. But is he confident? Is he bold? Is he assertive? Yes. Why? Because he knows who he is. And who is he? He is a child of God. He says, an angel of God whose what? I am. He knows who he is. You know, a lot of us, I think, as Christians today, we need to know who we are. You know? Listen, I might have my flaws and weaknesses and all of that stuff, but I am a child of God. You know? And I need to understand who I am. Paul knew who he was, and he knew who he what? Served. You know, the key here for Paul is simply this. He wasn't just a Christian. He was a Christian who was living for the Lord. Now, there's a difference. Thank God for people who are truly saved and have escaped the fires of hell. But we want more than that, I hope. You know, I don't want to just be saved from hell. I want to live as a Christian. I want to have the power of God on my life and the influence of God. What we see here too, as Paul goes through this centurion obviously, in the beginning, did he listen to Paul? He didn't pay no attention. But he's noticing, he's watching Paul. He's obviously hearing Paul. Because Paul's not just sitting back being quiet. Paul's took over the situation. But has he won at least the favor of this centurion? And you know, we talked a little bit in Sunday school this morning. Ahithophel gave advice to Absalom, and Shusha then came back and gave other counsel to Absalom. Whose advice did Absalom listen to? Ahithophel or Shusha? He listened to Shusha. Now, we talked about it in such did both give good advice? You know, if you look at Ahithophel's advice, it was good counsel that he gave. Shusha's counsel was good counsel that he gave. Why did he choose to listen to Shusha instead? And I'll probably not pronounce that right, but anyway, you know who I'm talking about. Why did he listen to him instead of Ahithophel? Because the Bible tells us clearly, God put it in his heart to do so. Listen, will God bring you into favor with people? He will. We're going to look at that in just a second. God will bring me as a child, his child, when I need favor with somebody in a particular service. God will bring me into favor. Is that because of me? It's because of God. You know, so Paul says, you know, whose I am and whom I serve. Listen, I'm a child of God. If I'm truly, honestly living, serving God, is God working in my life? Yes. Is he going to use me? All right, so in this story then, we go on and we read it several times. We'll not go back and do it again, but several times we read here, I think it was 5, he says, Paul said, Paul said, Paul said. You know, Paul's taking control here. You know, one of the things that I think is interesting is this. You know, Paul is by nature what we call a type A personality. I mean, if you go back to when he was Saul of Tarsus, was Saul shy and withdrawn, you know, kind of backwards no, that wasn't Saul. Saul was a type A personality. I mean, he's bold, that's his personality, I think. That's just a natural personality that he has. So Paul now finds himself in this situation. That is a natural personality that Paul has. But when you add to that his walk with God and his confidence in God and his boldness in God, do you think he's more, in a sense, bold than he was when he was Saul of Tarsus? Is he even more bold as Paul? I think he is, because now he knows what? It's not just me, it's God in me. And I'm the servant of God. And so he was bold. You know, I read this and I say, my point was simply this. We need to be bold and we need to be assertive and we need to be confident. Would you say that's true? I think all of us would agree. We need to be bold in our walk with God. We need to be, assertive, and we need to be confident. But is that easier for a type A personality person? Does that just come natural for a person with that type of personality? I think it does. So I can look at myself and I say, well, that's not my personality. That's not how God wired me. He didn't make me like that. And can I use that then to be an excuse? Can that become an excuse for me? For Paul, he was wired that way. Yeah, Paul, we see. But I'm not wired that way. If I begin to use that for an excuse, am I hurting my own walk with God? Listen, has God called, has He called me to be bold, assertive, and confident? Yes. Not just if I'm wired that way. Listen, the one that comes to me, and we won't turn to it for the sake of time, when the angel of the Lord appeared to Gideon, what was he doing? He was hiding in a threshing floor. Because, what? He was a mighty man of valor. Listen, was he a mighty man of valor when the angel of the Lord appeared to him hiding in the threshing floor? Listen, but did God still call him to be what? And God said to Gideon, thou mighty man of valor. Listen, was that really Gideon's personality? Was that really who Gideon was when the angel of the Lord appeared? No. But listen, when God takes over our lives, when we really surrender our lives, when we're really, living for Him, and we know who we are in Christ, and we know that we're His and we're serving Him, listen, even though we're not necessarily wired that way, can we still be bold, and can we still be assertive? Can we still be confident? We can, and we should. Okay, so we don't use that as an excuse. But because Paul took over, 276 people were saved. What if Paul hadn't took over? Now, could God have just saved Paul? No doubt. Paul could have been the only survivor if that's what God so chose. It doesn't say here, but I think Paul was praying for the other men. I honestly think that this situation, now this has been going on. Obviously, they're caught up in some type of a typhoon or what we would call a hurricane or whatever. And this has been going on for 14 days. I mean, it's been a horrific experience. I don't doubt for a second Paul has been praying for the other men on this ship. You know what? I think he is witnessing boldly to all of these men on the ship. And we see that, I think, in the fact that God turned the heart of the centurion. But you think that was because Paul was quiet and reserved and shy? No, it's because Paul sees this situation. He took this situation and he used it and he preached the gospel to men who are what? They're looking at perishing. Where was it? In verse 20. And it says in verse 20 at the end of the verse that all hope that we should be saved was then taken away. These men are in this situation. Is it hopeless? Everything that they see, they're in a hopeless situation. They think they're going to perish. Is that a good time for Paul to be a witness to these men? I'm so sure 275 people didn't get saved. But it was because Paul took over and he asserted himself. All right, so God used what? One man in a situation, and because of his boldness and his assertiveness and his confidence, and as he took over this situation, we see how God delivered the whole boat. The next one we want to look at is another very familiar story. Look, if you will, at Daniel chapter 3. In Daniel chapter 3, we have another story. I'm going to read a good part of it, and like I say, it's very familiar, so we won't have to say much. But in verse 13, it says this, Then Nebuchadnezzar, in his rage and fury, commanded to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Then they brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar spake and said unto them, Is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? Do not ye serve thy gods, nor worship the golden image which I have set up? Now, if ye be ready, that at what time ye hear the sound of the cornet, the flute, the harp, the sackbut, the palmistry, the dulcimer, and all kinds of music, ye fall down and worship the image which I have made. Well, but if you worship not, you shall be cast the same hour into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. And who is that God that shall deliver you out of my hands? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we are not careful to answer thee in this matter. If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of thine hand, O king. But if not, be it known unto thee, O king, that we will not serve thy gods nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. Then was Nebuchadnezzar full of fury, and the form of his visage was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Wherefore he spake and commanded that they should be heat the furnace 17 times more than it was wont or needed to be heated. And he commanded the most mighty men that were in his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and to cast them into the burning fiery furnace. Then these men were bound in their coats and their hosen and their hats and their upper garments and were casted into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. I don't know, have you ever seen that movie, The Christmas Story with Ralphie and he wants to BB gun line? Whenever I read that, I always think of, you remember his little brother? I don't remember his name, but mom's dressing him up to go out and she's got all these clothes on him and all this, and I mean, he just can't, you know. And then he goes outside and he falls down, he can't get up, you know. And I always think of that when I read that part. How did, these men are just, like almost it gives you the impression, everything they own, and then they're what, tied up. In other words, they're really bound up into a place where they can't move. All right, so it says that these three men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell down bound into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king was astonished and rose up in haste and spake and said unto the counselors, Did not we cast three men bound into the midst of the fire? They answered and said unto the king, True, O king. He answered and said, Lo, I see 4 men loose. Remember how they were bound up to this. But he says, now we see 4 men loose, walking in the midst of the fire, and they have no hurt, and the form of the 4th is like the Son of God. Then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the mouth of the burning fiery furnace, and spoke and said, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, ye servants of the Most High God, come forth and come hither. Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came forth of the midst of the fire, and the princes, governors, captains, and all the king's counselors, being gathered together, saw these men, upon whose body the fire had no power, nor was a hair of their head singed, neither were their coats changed, nor the smell of fire had passed on them. Then Nebuchadnezzar spake and said, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who hath sent his angel and delivered his servants that trusted in him, and have changed the king's word, and yielded their bodies, that they might not serve nor worship any god, except their own God. Therefore, I make a decree that every people, nation, language, which speak anything amiss against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, shall be cut in pieces, and their houses shall be made a dunghill, because there is no other God that can deliver after this sort. And the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the providence of Babylon. So we see here, it's nice to be in a group. It's just nice sometimes. Paul on the ship, obviously, he had to stand alone. Sometimes we just simply are in situations. It could be at work or some type of, whatever it might be, where we just have to take a stand and we have to do it alone. But isn't it nice when you have people with you that you can stand in a group? You know, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego here, listen, could two of them have refused? But they didn't. There is a little something in this thing of if we stick together. Listen, can we draw strength from one another? I think we can and we should. Listen, God, I think, sometimes expects us to be bold, to be assertive. He expects us to take a stand. But, you know, sometimes we have to do it alone. But isn't it nice, too, that God gives us others around us who are children of God, who are saved, and we can collectively strengthen one another. And I think that's kind of what you see here with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So Nebuchadnezzar has made this golden image, and then they play all the music, and I know we all hear this is a very familiar story. They begin to play all of the music and all that, and they are to simply fall down, bow, worship. Listen, can you do that and be like, look, I don't know, some of you probably heard it's a joke, but it's kind of cute and all that. You know, this mother's on her son and he won't listen, all that stuff. And she put him in the chair and set him down and like, you will sit there. I might be sitting down on the outside, but what? Or I might be, sit down. You know, listen, we're like, you know what? Go over, bow to the image. The image is nothing. It don't mean anything. Isn't it easy to kind of think like that? That, listen, just go along with Nebuchadnezzar, humoring, you know. But the principle was simply this. You don't bow to an idol. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, listen, they're not going, is this idol anything? Is it a god? No, it's just a golden thing that Nebuchadnezzar built and called it a god. But they won't bow to it because he says it's a god, and they won't bow to this false god. They just will not do it. All right? And Nebuchadnezzar comes when he finds out they didn't bow. He comes and he says, he says, now, let me see how it says. It says, now, if you be ready. In other words, Nebuchadnezzar's giving them the what? Benefit of it. Maybe you didn't understand what you were supposed to do. But did they understand? They totally understood what they were to do. Now listen, Nebuchadnezzar tries to give them a second chance. And they're simply what? They have already made up their mind that no matter what, they are just simply not going to bow down to this image that Nebuchadnezzar has set up. All right, so in verse 17 and 18, these are like probably most of us almost memorize them. He says, if it be so, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of thine hand. But if not, be it known unto thee, O king, that we will not serve thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. Is this a pretty bold move? Now, I think if you have any understanding at all of history of Nebuchadnezzar, is this the kind of a king that when he gives you a command to do something, you say, nope, not going to do it? You just don't do that to Nebuchadnezzar. You know, at first Nebuchadnezzar was like, oh, okay, maybe y'all didn't understand. Because the truth is, I think he likes Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Listen, he's met them before, and he likes them. And they have made a good impression on him. He doesn't. But when they now are assertive in the fact that, no, we are not going to do it. Nebuchadnezzar is that strong personality too. And arrogant and everything that comes with being the king of the world. You know, at this time, he is the king of the known world of its day, and all of the pomp and arrogance and everything that goes with being that. And these three men have defied him. Well, that just, he can't take it. So he doesn't just throw them in the furnace. What does he do first? Heats it up 7 times hotter, you know, because he's going to really show everybody who's in control, you know. So he heats the furnace 7 times hotter. They throw them in with all these clothes. I just picture them all bound up and they're tied up. And as he throws them in, then he looks in the furnace and he sees not only them walking around, but he sees one likened to the Son of God. All right, so now, listen, would that change everything? Of course it did. But listen, go back to verse 17, 18. In verse 17, are they confident that God can and will deliver them? They are. But they say in this, verse 18, if not, be it known unto thee, O king, that we will not serve thy gods. Do they know that when they're thrown into this furnace, that they're going to be walking around with the angel of the Lord, you know, worshiping God and, you know, doing all, and then they're going to walk out? They don't know how it's going to end up. When Daniel was thrown into the lion's den, did he know that he would walk out the next morning? He didn't know that. All right, but he simply committed himself to doing what God said. And they understood this. No matter how it goes, do they win? Yeah, I think for us tonight, that's the thing that we need to learn, is that no matter how it goes, we can't lose. The worst thing the world can do to me is what? Kill me. So the world kills me, and I go to heaven. Boy, what a loser. No, what a winner. You know, the worst thing the world can do to me is kill me, and all I do then is I go to heaven, and now I get a martyr's crown. So they just made my going to heaven even more special than it would have been. All right, so the idea here, but the idea too is this. Did Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, did they just get there overnight? No. All right, real quick, let's just turn back to chapter 1. In chapter 1, we read this, in verse 8, Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with a portion of the king's meat. And he requested, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the prince of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. Now God had brought Daniel into favor and tender love with the prince of the eunuchs. And the prince of the eunuchs said unto Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who hath appointed your meat and your drink, for why should he see your faces worse liking than the children which are of your sort? Then shall you make me in danger of my head to the king. Then said Daniel to Melzar, whom the prince of the eunuchs had set over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, prove thy servants, I beseech thee, 10 days. So in verse 17, and as for these 4 children, God gave them knowledge and skill in all learning and wisdom, and Daniel in understanding in all visions and dreams. All right, so when they were first brought to Babylon, did they have to take a stand? Mm-hmm. They did. Now you remember these, we don't know exactly how, but they're probably teenage boys. Okay? And they're brought from their country to another country, and they're in this situation now where they can't eat the food that's put before them because of the Mosaic law and everything, the dietary, all that. They can't eat this food. All right? Does he go to the Melzar, the chief of the eunuchs, and demand that they put them on a different diet? No, he doesn't do that. Now listen, weren't we just saying you got to be bold, and you got to be assertive, and you've got to be confident. But listen, are there times too that you need to be discretionary? You need to have some discernment. Listen, when Daniel goes to Belshazzar in this situation, does he go with that bold assert? No, he goes with humility. And he's like, look, we can't eat this food. It's just against what, our God tells us to eat. But he says, do this. Give me what? 10 days. Give me 10 days and put us on a diet of pulse, beans and salad and that type of stuff. And if you don't see in 10 days that we look healthy, then okay. But listen, do we need sometimes to have discernment? I need to be bold. I need to be assertive. But there's times too that I need to simply be humble. And I need to come in. But what had God done? God had worked in the heart of Melchizedek to what? Gave him a heart for Daniel, a love for Daniel, and for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Will God prepare our circumstances? He will. And he'll bring people into our lives. And will he create the situation? All right, so God here has worked in Belshazzar, and he gives him the 10 days, and 10 days later they look what? Plumper and more healthy. And now he takes everybody and puts them on this diet. Now I can just imagine do you think this was popular with a lot of most of the other guys probably liked the steaks and the wine and everything because they were eating whose diet? The king's diet. So they were eating good. And now Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, they come in there and say, well, put us on this diet. And now this diet, I don't think it made them popular. But is popularity our goal? Doing God's will doesn't always make us popular. But the idea here was simply this. They needed discernment too. Listen, there's times we need to be bold and assertive and aggressive. But there's times too that we need to be humble. And we just simply need to make a request, a petition. But we need to do it in the right way. So God honored it when they did that. In chapter 2, we know the story. Nebuchadnezzar has a dream, and Nebuchadnezzar is no dumb guy. Now, number one, he couldn't remember the dream. But he does have enough discernment. He's a smart enough guy. If you can come up with the interpretation of the dream, then you ought to also what? Be able to tell me what the dream was. And that kind of proves that you know the interpretation. And nobody asks somebody to do that. That's just too much. But Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, long story short, do they come up with yes. God not only gives them the interpretation of the dream, but Daniel can go in before Nebuchadnezzar and he can say what the dream was. Now, when Nebuchadnezzar hears Daniel telling him the dream, does he have confidence? If he knows the dream, obviously his interpretation is sound too. All right. But the point is simply this: did Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, did they just show up in chapter 3 with their feet firmly planted in the Lord and determined to walk with God, or this has been building in their lives all along? You know what? We can't just stand for the Lord in a time of need. We have to be walking with God all along. Then when we find ourselves in that time of need, whether we have to stand by ourselves or whether we have people around us that God's given to us. But if we've been walking with God all along, if we've been standing for the things of God, is it easy then? Because we've been doing it all along. All right, just a couple quick verses and we'll end here. Success in the Christian life has always been because of absolute commitment to God and His Word. In Hebrews 6:11 it says, and we desire that every one of you do show the same diligence to the full assurance of hope unto the end. Hebrews 11:22, let us draw near to God with a true heart and full assurance of faith. Listen, full assurance. But full assurance comes from what? Walking with God. Faithfully walking with God builds that full assurance in our life. We don't have much time to go into it, and I think most all of us here tonight anyway really understand Hebrews chapter 11, verses 32 through 35. It gives us, we call this the Hall of Faith, and it gives a list there of all of the great men of God and how God, Gideon and Samson and David and Jephthah. Don't we love those stories? We love those stories in the Bible. Even here, Shadrach, Meshach, the fiery furnace, and Daniel in the lion's den. We love those stories. But unfortunately, I think we love those stories too much because they always end what? Victorious. Miraculously victorious. And we love that. But what did they say? If not. If not. What if they'd have been thrown into the fiery furnace and simply burned up and died? Would God have still delivered them? He would have, in the eternal sense that what? They would have went to heaven. It wasn't a... All right, but when we get to verse 36 in Hebrews 11, it switches gears and it says, and others. Because sometimes... And probably the truth is more times it doesn't end in miraculous deliverance by God. You remember the story, I think it's Acts chapter 12. Herod arrested James, and he says he killed him with the sword. And when he saw that it pleased the Jews, he went and he arrested Peter. And when he arrested Peter, and I think the next day they were going to execute Peter, the angel of the Lord came and delivered Peter from the prison. And as Peter's going out the door, as he gets out, he's like, it dawned on him. I think he thought he was dreaming. And it dawned on him, this is real. This has really happened. It's a shame God didn't love James as much as he loved Peter, right? Because God delivered Peter. He didn't deliver James. James was killed. Does God love James any less than he loved Peter? Of course not. God simply chose, and that's God's right as God. He's God. And that's where we, I think, struggle. We've got to let God be God in our lives. If God chooses to deliver me, can he do it? Yes. But what if he doesn't choose to deliver me? Is he any less God? Does he love me any less? God didn't love James any less because he delivered Peter and didn't deliver John. Stephen was stoned. And as he was about to die, he looks up and he sees Jesus what? Standing at the right hand of the Father. What a way to die. Seriously. I don't know, now we won't know till we get there. You hear different people say all these different things. But Peter, or we do know with Stephen, that the Bible tells us he beheld Jesus standing at the right hand. But did he die? In our economy of all of this, we look at this and we're too eternal, or we're not eternally minded enough. We're too focused on this world. Sometimes when things happen, we're like, oh, that's so horrible, that's so bad, what a shame. We had a family in Haiti, back over the summer, they were just killed, martyred, but murdered. And we look at that, and it is sad. From our human perspective, it is sad. And it seemed like such a tragedy. We think of Jim Elliot, back in the days of, when they went. But does God bring good out of those? He does. Now, we just simply have to let God, and that's hard sometimes. The truth is, it's hard sometimes because we don't always understand. You know, Mike Hager last week, he mentioned with Johnny Erickson Tyler, you know, look, could you imagine being a quadriplegic for 60, some 70? I couldn't imagine. But has God used her life and touched millions of people's lives that he would have never done had that not happened? It's horrible. We wouldn't wish that on any of our loved ones or ourselves. But did God use it and bring... So we just simply have to learn, and it's not always easy, but we have to learn to let God be God. All right, we're going to wrap it up here. Simply put, let's just say this. Listen, successful Christian life is always the result of a committed life. We walk by faith. We don't always understand, but we can always trust. Even when I don't understand the things that... And we live in a world that is just bent on distracting us in our walk with God. You know, a world with uncertainties, circumstances, it's just so much in our world, and all of it is designed by the world to distract the Christian. You know, do you really believe there's a devil? You know, there's a real devil, and there is a spirit that evades the world. And we've got to understand that it's real so that we don't get caught up in it. Because it'll cause us to lose our focus. It'll cause us to lose our determination. Okay, so with all of that said, we're going to stop there. Rebecca, you want to come play for us? Okay, we're going to let Rebecca play tonight. We're not going to sing, we're just going to simply let her play for a few minutes, but I will ask you to stand. Just bow your head, close your eyes, and just ask you to pray for a few minutes. Biggest thing is simply this: if you're here tonight, I believe everyone here tonight's saved, but you know, just because I believe everyone's saved, if God is really just impressed upon your heart, if you're not sure, if you don't really have that assurance, know that you know that you know that you're saved. We invite you to come up. We'll be glad to share with you some verses. You can leave here tonight knowing with no shadow of a doubt that you're saved. Or you can come tonight. Maybe you just have something on your heart, something you need to pray about. It could be a family, friend, just the circumstances, a situation in your life. Listen, you can pray at home. You can pray anywhere. But I think coming to the altar here, praying just really brings that prayer request in a special way before the throne of grace. So we invite you, if you want to come up, we'll be glad to talk to you. If you just simply want to come up and pray, we invite you to do that.